speaker, Christine Unsworth, in her paper entitled Ethical Concerns of Information Policy and Organization in National Security, asks a provocative question: will data that is collected and categorized according to a predetermined organizational scheme result in abuse of power? Chris is a PhD candidate at the University of Washington Information School. She plans on defending her dissertation, Identifying the Enemy, Social Categorization, and National Security Policy this summer. Her work spans the areas of information policy, ethics, critical theory, and history. She's interested in the way social categories like stereotypes, expressions of prejudice, deviance, and normalcy are constructed, and uses critical discourse analysis to examine this use and the process by which these categories are created and implemented at the political level. She is specifically interested in how informal expressions of these categories are formalized and used for bureaucratic purposes in national security policy.
Move this back up here. And as you can tell from Ed's introduction, I'm going to take you on a bit of a different pathway for the next little bit. And oddly enough, some things that Janet was talking about resonated very much with me as a early LAS student taking courses in classification theory and ethics in the sense of library ethics and professional ethics. Is honestly when I started thinking about the effects of classification, the role of categorization and organization as it has to do with individuals. And if in fact there's something that we as information professionals could offer when talking about information policy and when perhaps helping write information policy as it relates to national security. So I want to start my talk with this great quote that I found online a while ago. Edmund Burke is referencing Jerry Montesquieu, and I'll just read it. Montesquieu observed very justly that in their classification of citizens, the great legislators of antiquity made the greatest display of their powers. I love this quote because it very nicely contains what I'm talking about and the connection that I see between classification and information organization, which you will find I use a bit interchangeably, and power and information policy. And so I just think it was a beautiful way to start out this conversation. Information can be organized in any number of ways, dependent on the needs of the individual or the community for which the scheme is designed. This organization is influenced by ideology, whether it's a personal belief system, organizational practice, or a national ideology. The primary means for organization is classification. And as Elaine Spinoni so succinctly put it, classification brings like things together. That works the same for physical pieces of paper, bottles, whatever, as many governments and other institutions. We have the great slide from the mental health institution. We bring like things together and classify them. Organization as well as classification consists of identification, naming, and assignment. Linguistically, at the nominative level, classification is a process that helps us deal with complexity through placement of items or concepts into categories. And the word holds an additional meaning as well. And the dichotomy between the two is particularly relevant for this paper. In the Oxford English Dictionary, we have two very common definitions for classification, classify. One, which we all are familiar with and what many of us do, is to arrange in classes or categories. And the other, which is equally important in the work I'm doing, is classification or to classify as an official secret. Most commonly in the world of information organization, classification is used as a tool for access and for retrieval. When we as information professionals create classification schemes with their multitude of categories and subcategories, we try to be explicit to the extent that we want our patrons to be able to use these systems. We want them to understand to a degree how the scheme is designed so that they can use it to the fullest. In national security information policy, however, information is organized with the goal of retrieval, but it is only accessible to those with a certain security level clearance. The structure of these classification schemes is not transparent or even available often to the public, and most likely only to a limited degree for the approved user. Access is dependent upon individual classification within the scheme of authorization, and classification is used as a means of security as well as one of secrecy. Access in this realm is strictly monitored and enforced. Documents, be they digital or physical, are restricted on various levels, and authorization is required for access. So we have this dual nature of classification. And within this, one of the many questions that I will ask over the next few slides is, can we talk about similar ethical implications in these two different cases? Can similar implications be drawn when at the one time we're restricting information but providing access for a very specific purpose, and on the other hand we're designing for access? So when we talk about ethics of classification, I, of course, referred back to Hope Goldstein's paper from '99, and she wrote that classification is a cultural construction. As language is both constructive and reflexive, classification as part of language works in a similar way. Authentic representation of the subject is certainly a goal. We want an authentic representation for a user group for which the classification or the organizational scheme is designed. But we also strive for authentic representation given the socio-historical context of the subject. In government classification, and these are two, they came out fairly large. These are from a OMB Watch report that came out in 2005. That talked about government classification since September 11th. And the first is from a memo by whose name I forget, I'm sorry, but basically saying that the first thing that needed to be done, since this memo came out in 2002, the first thing that needed to be done was that all government documents, whether they be classified, reclassified, declassified, whatever, this process needed to be gone through one more time. And on top of that, a new category needed to be instituted called sensitive but unclassified information. Then Attorney General Ashcroft continued with this general trend with a memo saying that no matter what we're doing with this classification, we're still going to hold by the Freedom of Information Act, but we're doing this to protect all of these stakeholders in society, and last but not least, personal privacy. Interestingly enough, even though the Obama administration has promised a greater amount of transparency, a large number of these documents are just gone from the websites. They have been classified, reclassified, reorganized, if you will, into an area that we don't have access to. Whether or not these are actually sensitive to the degree that they would be a problem for national security is hard to say. Many of the documents can be found in different places. For example, a large number of GIS maps, for instance, are duplicated at different websites throughout the United States. So the fact that the government closes off that channel is just a part of a policy that hopefully will be changed or will be changing. So this is a big jump from the U.S. policy after September 11. But what I hope to do with these, I'm going to talk about 3 different cases that used different types of information organization and classification for national security in categorizing people that were considered disruptive members of society. I'm starting with what is generally considered the most oppressive of these regimes, and that is the Ministry for State Security of the German Democratic Republic. A large number of you probably saw the movie The Lives of Others, which did a fairly good job of talking about the way the machinery of the Stasi, as they were known, worked. And as I have written here, a goal was to know everything about everyone. And that just wasn't like a motto. That was from the lips of Erich Mielke, who was the head of the Ministry for State Security. A reason for this was that within the top levels of the government, deviation or behaviors that were outside of the norm of what the Marxist-Leninist ideology that they were proponing, it could not exist, period. Because if they did exist, then obviously there was unrest in a society where everyone should be taken care of. And so if there was deviance, then there was either a capitalist, imperialistic poison going through the system that was infecting the GDR citizenry. And they used this language very clearly. I was there in September doing research in the archives, and it's quite fascinating. So not only did they have this rhetoric in the documentation that was used by the ministry, they actually had a dictionary of terms that described the political operative work. This wasn't just, I list 4 terms here that are specifically relevant to what I'm talking about today, but the terms were also very much more bureaucratic terms. And this was supposed to be used as a handbook. And so the terms of dissident, enemy, traitor, my translations, dissident and renegade are actually in the dictionary itself. The use of dissident actually has, in the definition, it is a term used by the capitalist imperialistic enemy, as it says in the dictionary, to make the deviants in the GDR look like good guys. And so they use this term in a very, very particular way. Within these main categories, they have adjectives that were defined. So you could have a subversive or renegade who was part of a hostile group, or a negative person, or part of a negative group. And the key is that these are all somehow individuals who are working against the party line, and that somehow we're trying to undermine the Constitution or hostile to the way of life within the GDR. And some examples of these groups, some exemplars, if you will, are the following. And we all might, most of us, I bet, find ourselves fitting in here. Which I love this because when we talk about classifications as being constructions, it's very clear what's being constructed here. These are all organizations within the German Democratic Republic that question the authority of the status quo. Now, whether or not we can say, there are 2 things, and this is something I'm struggling with that I go back and forth with. Ethically, we certainly can say things that happened to these 2 individuals that were living in the GDR and what they went through, the people that were killed, the years many of these individuals spent in prison for being involved in church groups and organizations that might support punk rock concerts, which was where most of the punk rock concerts happened in the GDR, were at churches, because this was kind of like this free zone in the public. But as the 80s moved on and perestroika was becoming more and more of a possibility, the government really cracked down on this. And so you would have church officials being thrown into prison because of this. But within the context of the GDR elite, this was absolutely ethically the correct thing to do. It was what else? Their society is being poisoned, and this is the only way to stem the poison. And so going back and forth between what do we think about when we're creating classifications and categorizations of individuals and of their activities, there's a lot of questioning that needs to be done, self-reflective questioning of what is actually ethically correct or not. Another interesting thing with the GDR is, for them, the classification and the organization of those groups that I've shown was combined very closely with hate. And that's not just up there for drama because it's after lunch and I know everyone is tired. In the Russian Revolution, there was a group of secret military called the Chekists, and hate was one of their primary motivating factors. And the Ministry for State Security took a lot of their philosophies with them when they built the ministry in the late 50s. And hate was one of the primary tools they used to convince people to take part in identifying certain behaviors and categorizing individuals as subversives and to fit into this. And it's not just, oh, I don't like that person very much, or, you know, whatever. It's the very last part of this. There's a need to destroy and to harm him, to eradicate him. And again, to reiterate the part you said a few slides ago, the thought that there could be dissent within the population was that somehow there was infiltration by the West, and somehow the West was poisoning what otherwise would have been a Marxist-Leninist utopia. At least that was the official rhetoric. So moving from there, I want to talk about another famous organization that we're all familiar with that has used categorizations, and gotten into trouble with it. So the House Committee on Un-American Activities started originally in the late 30s and did a lot of work focusing on fascism, the German American Bund, and the Ku Klux Klan. A little later they moved into trying to root out communists, but it was slightly similar in the sense that there were these subversive forces within the United States that were seeking to destroy our democracy. And in '48, the committee had been around for about 10 years. Already the American public were up in arms about the fact that they were bringing people in for questioning. University professors were losing their jobs because they were being accused of being communists. The Hollywood stars were starting to be brought in. All of this was happening. And in, I believe it was 46, excuse me if I have that date wrong, but Martin Dees stepped down from the committee. It was originally called the Dees Committee, and he stepped down and was asked to leave. But Carl Munt, who was a representative from South Dakota, stayed on the committee, and he had been there since its inception. And in an attempt to create some legitimacy with the American people, he sent out a letter to 100 common Americans. And he asked them in this letter, could you please tell me what you consider to be an un-American activity? And he got about a 75% response rate. He sent the letters to the Brookings Institute, which then wrote a little pamphlet and that was then incorporated into their rules and regulations. And this is the beginning of a radio address that he gave in '48 in New York City. And I bring this up because of how vague it is and how difficult it is to define what this category is, what it can be. But the committee certainly lived on until the 70s, working with this kind of vagueness. The information he got back from the letters were incorporated into these rules of procedure for the committee. And this is something that you can read this for yourself. I think it's large enough. Something that I find quite fascinating and in relation to the concept of classification or of being placed into a category is in section 10, it explains what happens to a person who has been named. And the person might not know they've been named. So this is a guideline for what you as an official should do if, say, you had been named as one of these characters. So these are the steps that we go through in naming someone as communist, subversive, fascist, or part of a front organization. So this is very powerful. A statement is sent out to the individual that he or she has been so named, the date and time of the set hearing. So, oh, you are X, come to a hearing here. Interestingly enough, the name of the person who so testified is also given, which I think is quite interesting. And maybe I don't know, a glowing candle of hope in our democracy. I'm not so sure. But that was also given, what you were named as, and then a copy of this little pamphlet. So you can get it in any GovPub's library will have it. So this is just in contrast to what was going on in East Germany with the concern that we had here in the U.S. and a similar kind of Cold War concern of naming and placing people into categories in this huge organizational structure that was based around giving some sort of legitimacy to our ideologies. And the final example is something that is going on today. And at least in Seattle, and I would guess in most of the cities you live in, on the buses or on other public transportation, there are signs that say if you see something, say something, or report suspicious activity. And these are all types of advertisements to get us to take part in surveying each other. And so they're based after the Citizen Neighborhood Watch programs, which were popularized in the 70s. And though they weren't incredibly effective, they did some good. And so we already have this kind of stable thing here in America that it's good to watch out for you. And that's something you should do. Morally, you should be careful, keep an eye out for other people. But it leaves me with some questions. What experiences do we draw on when we're making our assumptions about suspicious behavior? Tourists can be really suspicious. There were some suspicious tourists on the ferry in Seattle a couple of years ago, and pictures were taken and their photos were put on the newspaper. And still, if you do a Google search for Washington State security suspicious, their images come up. They weren't doing anything suspicious. They were taking pictures. But they looked of Middle Eastern descent. I think they were Greek, actually. That seems like an ethical problem to me that is not being addressed when we're talking about information organization, classification, and categorization within national security policy and government policy. But what guidance do we have? Are there ethical guidelines we can fall back on if we're unsure? Bush, in the State of the Union address in 2002, talked about how everyone had to take part in this culture of responsibility, the bravery and generosity of the ordinary citizens were helping to overcome evil with the greater good. This is all incorporated with these programs to watch and be alert. And we do have a few tips. And the first two, absolutely. told you or overhear of someone discussing a future plan for a terrorist act. You hear or know of someone who has bragged or talked about killing or harming citizens. But then it starts to get a little more fuzzy. You see someone unfamiliar avoid loitering in a parking lot, a government building, or around a school or playground. A few other that I don't have here are you see someone fishing in an odd place. You can go to the national response. Exactly, that's where you fish, right? That's what I did growing up in the country. You see someone taking photos. You see someone paying attention to an area that's marked secret or stay away. Well, how many people, if you see a sign that says stay away, don't go over and kind of look to see? Anyway, those are other guidelines. And when we, as citizens, or I don't think you have to be a citizen, I think you can call these numbers. Oh, by the way, the number to call is 1-877-24-WATCH, which is a nice mnemonic. You call and train professionals. I don't know who they are, I haven't been able to get that information. Will vet your data that you have seen and either follow up on it or not. So that's what we're left with. And this is what I'm left with. This is my last slide, and these are some final questions. But starting before that, I just want to say the implications of information organization are embedded with ethical decisions and assumptions. Within the power structure of those designing the organization scheme, who or what activities included may seem entirely justified at the time. But is there a chance that we can apply ethical standards to national security? Must mistakes always become historical lessons? Do we always have to go back and say, oh, oops, sorry, you lost 3 months. You lost a family member. They really weren't who we thought they were. But their behavior was suspicious. And can policy be constrained to allow time for ethical decision making? I believe strongly that discussions that we have here in information science can lend a great deal of information to dealing with these kind of information policy issues. And we'd love to hear what any of you think about that.
Questions? Questions? Yes.
I think it's kind of, so 3 things just to lead up to my question. So you mentioned homogeneous definitions of classification as a cultural construct. So by that we will learn that classification evolves within a cultural field. And early on we learned the famous quote from Wittgenstein about trying to speak and be able to understand, which talks to me about if you're not part of the culture, would you be able to understand that culture from sort of looking from the inside? And earlier today, Claire showed us the view from the night. So you're viewing sort of everything from your own little point of view. I'm just wondering if you can sort of talk a little bit about the interaction between these constructs of structures or categories and cultures that they are part of, and can we separate that? So that's one part of the question. What comes first is the cultural version of the classification. So that's one part of the question. And then I have something. The second question, that's just a small.
Okay.
But the more important question is, what does this have to do with ethics? I mean, is there a way that an ethical standard can tell us, no, don't do this because it's ethically immoral? Because that shows that there's somebody, not on the night street, but somewhere else looking above us saying, this is wrong, this is not.
Well, last question first. I think it's funny that you mentioned that because there's someone who always says to me, this has nothing to do with ethics. Leave it out. It's just making it more difficult. It has everything to do with ethics to me because the fact that currently we have advertising campaigns that say report suspicious behavior doesn't just come from, a think tank, let's try this. There's policy written about that, and there's a reason that it's done. And policy is not written in an ethical vacuum. And so, but then we get to the question, well, if it's all wrapped up in ideology, can we still talk about it as being ethical? And I think we can. And I think that there are some guidelines. Lily, I have the full citation in my paper, talks about some potential guidelines for being a little more careful before we go and make these decisions, like reporting suspicious behavior, invading people's privacy rights, and so on. And I think that then brings in some ethical situations. And I know Helen Nissenbaum certainly looked at this from an ethical standpoint as well. So your first question, if you would repeat it.
The interaction between...
you know, I'm really struggling with that because on the one hand, there are certain things that are suspicious and dangerous that we are kind of hardwired to know. You know, if it's 2 o'clock in the morning and I walk past an alley and it's dark and I see some people hanging out down there, I'm probably not going to take a shortcut home, right? So when it has to do with threat, perhaps it doesn't matter. Perhaps ideology, those things are the same. And I'm leaning towards, and with the research that I'm doing and why I'm looking at 3 fairly disparate cases, is that it seems thus far in my work that making these categories, identifying these categories, that process, that little mundane bureaucratic process is the same regardless of the ideological system. The underlying reasons might be very, very different, but the process, the creation of an organizational scheme, if you will, is quite similar. And maybe there is some place that we can add some guidance, some suggestions.
Yeah, I couldn't help but think about the notion of objective guilt in the Soviet system. This connects for me with something that I am fascinated with, and that is the Bayesian interpretation of truth, which is whatever is statistically true for a population at a given point is true for the Bayesian. And when you put this notion of objective guilt and Bayesian statistical truth together, you get what we would call racial profiling or gender stereotypes or prejudices of this or that kind. But they're being put forth nowadays as, say, the wisdom of the crowd.
That's true.
And this is something that I find both fascinating because with Google we can see how useful stereotypes and prejudices and statistical predominance is for general searching. But I find the advocacy of these things without understanding that this is exactly prejudice, stereotype, profiling. This is something that I find very, very disturbing, and am trying my best to get a handle on.
It's huge. I like to call it preemptive retrieval, as the sense of scanning the society, scanning groups of people, scanning databases for signs of threat, signs of danger, just in case we find risk out there. And Bush said, I don't know if it was in a State of the Union address, I don't believe it was, that there was some media criticism that we were actually racially profiling. And he responded that no, there's no racial profiling in America except when it comes to national security. So,
I think, I don't know, this may be stretching away from what you're looking at, but I actually came to this issue from studying error theory in mathematics. And Deborah Mayo's book, Error and the Growth of Knowledge, she attacks the Bayesians. And her comment is it is only through looking at where our generalizations and our theories don't work the problems, the two Greeks,
Right.
are the only way we can go forward.
Right.
By paying attention to where it goes wrong.
That's exactly right.
And that's a long way from objective guilt to Bayesian mathematics, but your talk really
it works,
really
and it's the same,
together
you
wonderfully.
know, where the mistakes have been made. Brandon Mayfield's fingerprints being falsely interpreted, and he was accused of being the Madrid bomber. Mahir Arar in Canada being, taken to Syria and held for 10 months. All of those cases, those are the areas that we can look at to see the holes and to see where this is terrifyingly kind of...
And I think the main mistake there is to take sociological generalizations and say that they have validity on individual cases. And that's really a misunderstanding of statistical knowledge.
There's a question over here.
But this brought up for me, and it may be tangential, but was a recent instance in which a librarian basically turned in a user for child pornography on screen. And I think this comes up a lot in public libraries, which is the degree to which librarians need to identify threats. And they often feel compelled to do so because it is a public place and they feel they have to protect the children and that kind of thing. And yet, they're totally not qualified to identify those threats. I'm thinking, this poor guy was looking at pictures of his grandchildren. But I think this happens a lot, and I think it's a big issue in the public library.
Well, and I think it's a really important point. I was talking to a friend who works for the Department of Homeland Security now and previously worked at Border Patrol, and I was asking her what kind of training she got. And she said, oh, you can just tell the factors. We don't get training. And, I would give so much to actually know that. Well, not enough that I would join those sorts of things. But getting that information, and a brilliant paper was done a number of years ago on people working at Border Patrol and Immigration, and it was very similar. You learn just by talking to superiors and watching people, and you know who that is.
One more question over here.
I was just curious about if you explore different cultures and expectations of privacy too, because if I'm fishing in a suspicious place, I'm not thinking that somebody's going to be calling the Department of Homeland Security.
Should be.
Right, I know that now. Thank you. But maybe if I'm living, say, in Pakistan or Israel or somewhere where there's less of an expectation of privacy, that I would think that, and I'm just wondering if you had explored.
I haven't. I'm sure that's true. This project, I'm really only trying to get at the creation of these categories and this movement from racial stereotypes, prejudices, to formal bureaucratic language and how that's working. Later on we'll see. But at this point, what I'm really interested in is how is this organizational structure formed and used when it's really drawing on fear.
Thank you very much. It's time for our afternoon break. We'll take a 15-minute